Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be talking about Latin squares and Latin cubes and how you can realize partitions as sets of subsquares and subcubes. All right, so I'm going to start by introducing Latin squares and Latin cubes, and then introducing what a realization is and the problem we've been looking at. I'll talk about some of the results for that problem, and then how to extend that problem to Latin cubes and even to hypercubes in higher dimensions. All right, so if you're already familiar with Latin squares, you may like to have a go at filling in these Latin squares. It may or may not be possible. All right, so if you've ever played Sudoku, you'll know that this is a classic Sudoku grid, and the rules of Sudoku are to put every number exactly once in every row, exactly once in every column, and exactly once in each of these smaller grids, right? So this is Sudoku, and this is basically a Latin square. So if you forget about the smaller grids and you just care about the rows and columns, that's exactly a Latin square. So a Latin square is just an n by n grid where every number occurs exactly once in every row and exactly once in every column. That's it. It's that simple. So a subsquare of a Latin square is a smaller Latin square within a Latin square. So I've got two examples here. You can see the first one is a 2 by 2, like an order 2 subsquare of a Latin square. And the second one is an order 3 subsquare of an order 6 square. So a subsquare is just a smaller Latin square within a Latin square. And the second one shows they don't have to be nicely in consecutive rows or columns. They can be spread out, because permuting the rows and columns of a Latin square still gives us another Latin square. All right, and we can take this whole idea and extend it into more dimensions. So a Latin cube is an n by n by n array with n symbols, each occurring exactly once in every row, every column, and every file. And so a Latin cube, if we tried to fill this cube with numbers here, it's really hard to see all the numbers. You'd only see sort of the first layer. And so we often represent these instead as n layers, so n different Latin squares. You can imagine like taking your cube like a loaf of bread and slicing it into n layers. That's exactly what we've done. So instead of representing it as this cube, we use all of these individual Latin squares. So, and just like with squares, we can take a subcube, and this is again just a smaller cube within a Latin cube. And so here is an order 5 Latin cube with an order 2 subcube. So you can see the 5 Latin squares that make up the 5 layers of the cube, and then the 2 smaller squares which make up the 2 layers of the subcube. All right, so we've got Latin squares, we've got and subsquares, Latin cubes with subcubes. We can keep going into as many dimensions as we like and have a Latin hypercube. So at m dimensions, this is going to give you sort of m different ways to create a line of n cells. And in each of these sort of lines, you have to have every symbol occurring exactly once. So the same idea. And here is an example of a 4-dimensional hypercube of order 2. So just as a cube could be represented as n squares, a 4-dimensional hypercube can be represented as n cubes. And so this here is a order 2 4-dimensional hypercube. So you've got 2 cubes, and each cube is 2 squares. And you can see each row, column, file, and the 4th dimension also have every symbol, like both 1 and 2. Okay. All right, and we can take sub-hypercubes of these hypercubes, just like we took squares and cubes. And for the rest of the talk, like the important thing to note is if we have a square, like the number of dimensions of the whole like hypercube matches the sub-hypercubes. So a square has subsquares, a cube has subcubes, a 4-dimensional hypercube has 4-dimensional sub-hypercubes, etc. But we'll mostly stick to squares and cubes. All right. And briefly, a partition is a set of integers adding up to n. So you take some integer n and you break it up into a set of different integers. So an example here, if we take n to be 9, then we can break it up into 4, 2, 2, 1. And that's what we call a partition. So it's just a set of integers which add up to a particular integer. And there's a few different ways that you can represent these. You can just have all the numbers with commas, but I'm going to use this power notation. So the 4 to the 1, 2 to the 2, 1 to the 1. And the powers just represent how many copies of that integer are in your partition. So you've got these important ideas, a Latin square, a cube, and now a partition. And we can combine these with what we call a realization. So if you take a partition of n, a realization of this is a Latin square of order n with subsquares that have the same sizes as the parts of your partition. So probably best with an example. If you take our partition 4, 2, 2, 1, a realization of this is a Latin square with subsquares of sizes 4, 2, 2, and 1. And we want them to be disjoint, so they have to be in different rows, in different columns, and have different numbers in them. So here's an example of one with numbers. So this is a 2, 1, 1, 1. So you have a 2 by 2 subsquare and 3 1 by 1 subsquares, and they all have different numbers. And so you can see they're all in different rows, columns, and have different numbers. They don't have to be on this main diagonal. We can move them around as much as we like, because shuffling rows and columns doesn't matter, but we prefer to put them on the diagonal just for simplicity. Okay. So this is a realization. But why do we care about realizations? Well, there was this question asked by Fuchs. He asked about quasigroups, whether you can find a quasigroup of order n with subquasigroups corresponding to the parts of your partition. Now, this is quite a very complicated question with lots of big words, but it turns out quasigroups are equivalent to Latin squares. So all this is really asking is, if you have a partition, can you realize, is there a realization of that partition? And so now the question is, well, okay, if I have a partition, can I find a Latin square with this set of subsquares that are all disjoint? And is it possible to fill that square? And it may seem like, okay, sure, if I set up the subsquares, surely I can fill numbers around them and it'll be fine. But let's have a look at those squares from the start. So if anyone had a go, does anyone know if it's possible to fill the first one? I don't know if anyone can put things in chat. Oh, yes, they have chat. No, yeah, exactly. It's not possible. So any of the empty cells cannot be 1, 2, 3, or 4, because those are all in line with those cells. So there's no way to fill any of the empty cells. So that one is not possible. And the second one here is possible. So the second one is a realization of partition 2, 2, 2. It can be filled in a number of different ways, and this is one of them. All right. If you're not convinced that there are some that don't work, the partition 1, 1 cannot be realized for a Latin square. So this is the only order 2 Latin square. And as you can see, those two diagonal cells have to have the same number. You can't have different numbers. And so it's not possible to realize 1, 1. All right. So there are some partitions which can be realized and some which cannot. So the problem that we've been looking at is, okay, whether they can or they can't. And so this is an unsolved problem so far, like it's not complete, but I'll have a look at some of the things we do know. So there have been two different approaches to solving this problem. The first is to limit the number of different subsquares. So if you have just one subsquare, that's just the entire square and it always exists. If you have two subsquares, this never exists. You cannot do anything with two subsquares. If there are 3 subsquares, they have to all be exactly the same size. And if there are 4 subsquares, then either the largest 3 subsquares are the same or the smallest 3 are the same and the largest one isn't too big. And if you have 5, I have since completed 5, but it doesn't have any nice, the rules are not as nice as this. But 6 onwards is chaos. There's partial results, but nothing complete. So the other approach to solving this problem has been to limit the number of different integers in a partition. So if you take just one integer and you have multiple copies of that integer, then that exists as long as it's not exactly 2 copies. And if you have 2 different integers, there are some bounds here. It's completely determined within these bounds. All right, so this has been squares. This is mostly what's known for squares. But what we can do is extend this entire question into cubes. So like we had a square with subsquares, a realization in 3 dimensions is a cube with subcubes. So here's an example of that. Here's an order 5 Latin cube with the subcubes corresponding to 2, 2, 1. So there's 2 order 2 subcubes and 1 order 1 subcube. And as you can see, they're in different rows, in different columns, different layers as well, and they have different numbers. So it's the same idea, but now we're working with cubes rather than squares. So there's an extra dimension to worry about. Okay. And so the question, of course, is, well, we've extended to cubes, but is this actually any different to squares? Is it a similar problem? Are they connected? Is it any different? The answer is actually yes. So if you remember, you can't realize 1, 1 in a square, but you can realize 1, 1 as a cube. So those 2 diagonal cells in a cube are now opposite symbols, and so you can realize it is a realization of 1, 1. So there are partitions which can be realized in a cube, which cannot be realized in a square. So, okay, the next question, well, are there any partitions the other direction that can be realized in a square but can't in a cube? And the answer to that one that we found is no. So any partition which can be realized in a square can also be realized as a cube. So if you can realize something as a square, you can actually turn that into a cube as well. And so this is really interesting because it tells us that anything, that there are partitions, there are plenty of partitions which can be realized in a cube that cannot in a square. So there are far more that exist for a cube than in a square. And squares are actually sort of a stricter solution. There are less that exist, which is quite interesting. But what's more interesting is that the way of constructing the cube is actually very simple. So if you have the square, then constructing the cube is actually very simple to do. So I'll explain how we do this with an example. So if we take this realization of 2, 2, 2, we have our 3 order 2 subsquares, and our cube is going to need 6 layers. So let's bring up 6 layers. All right. Now, to fill each layer, there's a very simple process. For the first layer, we want to look at the first column of our square. We want to shuffle the rows of the square so that we get the numbers in that first column to be 1 through to 6. So here we go, we get 1 through 6, and that's our first layer. For the second layer, we look at the second column, we shuffle the rows to be 1 through to 6, and that's our second layer. And third layer, same thing, third column, shuffle. Now we have a third layer, and keep doing that, 4, 5, and 6. So this, due to the properties of a Latin square, this is always guaranteed to actually give a Latin cube. So using this row shuffling method, we'll always have a Latin cube. The only thing we now have to worry about is, does this give the subsquares? In fact, if I remove the colors there, you can see the 3 subcubes that we want in our cube. So you've got the 3 subcubes of order 2, each all in different rows, columns, layers, and having different numbers. So this is a very simple construction for getting a Latin cube from a square. And so since we know that we can get any cube that could be realized as a square, really for the cubes, we want to look at how we can change the bounds that we have for squares. So there's those results we have for squares. The cubes, we want to sort of look at those bounds and see how we need to change them to incorporate all the partitions, which can also be realized in a cube. So we've been looking at partitions with at most 2 distinct integers. So if you just have 1 integer, that exists for a square as long as it's not 2 copies. For a cube, that just always exists. There's no bounds on that. It just always exists. If you have 1 large subsquare and 2 smaller subsquares, that never exists for a square. And for a cube, that exists as long as your large square isn't too large. And this carries on for all partitions with at most 2 distinct integers. Either they did not exist and now they exist within some bounds, or they existed within some bounds and now they exist within better bounds. So there's more that exist. So in all these cases, there are more partitions which can be realized as a cube than for a square. These cases have all been improved. And this is quite interesting because constructing these is actually far more difficult. So constructing a cube is a lot harder than a square because they have that extra dimension to worry about. A lot of the construction methods which work for squares don't work for cubes. So it's a lot harder to construct these cubes. And they're also a lot more difficult to find computationally. So because they have that extra dimension, they have a lot more cells to fill. And so running a computer search takes a lot longer than a square. So they're a lot harder to find, and yet there are a lot more of them, like there are a lot more partitions for which they do exist. So that's actually quite interesting. But we don't have to stop there. Constructing these though, some of these can be constructed quite nicely. So we can use actually a similar approach to the one that we started with realizations and to get the cube from. We can use a similar approach. So if we look at the case where we have one large subsquare and then a bunch of smaller subsquares, for some of these cases, the realization will exist, and so we can get the cube. But for others, the realization does not exist. However, we can use a similar square and the same method of computing the rows to create the layers. So as an example, if we look at 3, 2, 2, if we had the realization, it would have these 3 subsquares. It would have the order 3 subsquare and the 2 order 2 subsquares. But we know that this realization doesn't exist in a square. We can't do this. We can't fill the rest of this. So we can't use this square to construct the cube. We can, however, replace the second and third subsquares with just the numbers 1 and 2, and then move those 2 subsquares to the top row. And then this turns out, no matter what numbers you picked for your partition, this can always be filled. And if we use the same choose a column, permute the rows approach as before, this will actually give the realization in a cube that we want. So the construction method for this is actually quite simple for this case. However, this doesn't work for all partitions. It just works for some partitions. In this case, it works for partitions of this form quite nicely. But we don't have to stop at cubes. We can look at hypercubes as well. So if we have a realization in a square, we can get a realization in a cube. And it turns out we found if you have a realization in a square, you can get a realization in any dimensional hypercube. So you can just keep building these in a similar method to the shuffling row approach. You can just keep building up from a square and you can get everything. So what this tells us is that squares are actually the sort of the strictest version of this problem. They have the fewest partitions which can be realized. And so this is quite interesting. But this also then leads to the question of, okay, well, if we can go from squares to any other dimension, can we go from cubes to any dimension? Or can we go from 4 dimensions to any dimension? And it's not quite. So if you start with an m-dimensional realization, you can get every number of dimensions that is 1 mod m minus 1. So squares will give you everything 1 mod 1, which is everything. Cubes will give you everything 1 mod 2, which is all the odd numbers. 4 dimensions will give you everything 1 mod 3, which is 4, 7, 10, etc. So they start to get sort of further and further spaced apart. So the higher the number of dimensions you start with, sort of the less other dimensions you can get. And this is, in fact, like 3 can be shown to not give 4 in general, with a lovely counterexample. So 1, 1 could not be realized in a square, 1, 1 can be realized in a cube, but 1, 1 cannot be realized in 4 dimensions. So this tells us we cannot go from 3 dimensions to 4 in general, because 1, 1 does exist in 3, but not in 4. And in fact, 1, 1 can be realized for all odd dimensions and cannot for all even dimensions. So no odd dimensional hypercube will give you an even dimensional hypercube in general. And so, yeah, this is the problem we've been looking at, is how to extend this idea of a realization into cubes and hypercubes, and what that really means for the problem, and how they're also related. So I hope you've learned something about squares and cubes and hypercubes. And yeah, are there any questions?